Hi guys! So starting our new unit, this is the phylum Annelida, which is all the segmented worms. We've got about 43 slides to go through. I dwindled it down as much as I can, and we're hopefully going to knock this out in one session because a lot of it's pretty quick. I did post a Google Doc that has a bunch of videos and video clip links to it to kind of give you some idea on what's going on with these crazy critters. And that way it saves us a little bit of time from you having to listen to me in notes. So let's just get into it. All right, so the word Annelid actually means little ring, and these organisms are segmented, and a lot of times they just look like they're a stack of rings. So they do have a segmented body, and each individual ring segment is called a metamer. The worms will have a lot of them have little tiny, and they can be really small or really long, bristles or hairs along them called setae. The only ones that do not have setae are going to be the leeches, and they use these setae. They help hold them in the dirt and things when they burrow, and helps. Some of them are aquatic, and some help with swimming. They do have a coelom that is divided by a septum, like a septum in your nose. And so they have separate tissues. They do have that ecto, meso, and endoderm tissues. They are going to have some special functions. The individual segments can have special functions. Some of them will have things like antenna or photoreceptors. They don't have true eyeballs or anything like that, but they'll have like light sensitive parts of different segments and things like that. So we'll talk about that as we get into the different segments. And again, these guys do display something called metamerism. Metamerism just means that the body is segmented and each segment just looks like a copy of the next, although they don't necessarily have to be identical, but they do have segments that are just repetition, like they have rings on rings on rings on rings, and you couldn't tell the difference between one body segment and the next. This kind of reminds me of that little baby toy that's like the stick, and they have the different shaped rings that stack on them, kind of like that. The smallest ring at the anterior end of these worms is called the prostomium, which is like that very first like tip of the nose, and it looks a tiny bit different than the rest of them because it's a little rounder. So we're going to talk about the structure of these guys here soon, and then next week I will have some dissection assignments for you, all virtual, that I found, and later on in the week I think I ask you to do a labeling activity with the anatomy. So all right, so annelids can be really small, or they can go up to be like the giant earthworms. They can be 54 inches. That's pretty huge. But the world record is about 22 feet, which is crazy because I don't like worms because they resemble snakes too much. I'm 31 years old. My dad still puts my worm on my hook when we go fishing because I'm just not about that life. So they can range in various sizes. This is a little bit messy of a drawing here, so let me get a pen here, and we can just kind of follow this through. Okay, so the first thing I like to always go through is the path of food, and we've only got part of it here. So we do have a mouth, and that very first segment in the earthworm's body that is by the mouth is called the prostomium, and then it will enter into the pharynx, which remember is that like a tube-like structure, like the flatworms used, kind of like a straw, but now this is going to be on the inside of the body, and it is still very muscular. So that is this portion here. After it passes through the pharynx, food passes through the pharynx, it passes into the esophagus, and then it goes into the crop, which is kind of like a storage unit for food that is not digested yet. And then from the crop, it goes into the gizzard. And the way I remember crop, then the gizzard is they're just in alphabetical order. The gizzard is really hard. It almost feels like it has stones on the inside because as food passes through it, it gets ground up. And then it will pass, the food would pass into the intestine. Okay, so that's kind of in yellow here. We have the path of food through the ecosystem. Oh Jesus, the through the earthworm, through these segmented worms. Okay, and then some other things that are notable here. We do have a brain. Oh boy, you can't read that, can you? Let's try a different color. That's maybe a little lighter. Ooh. Oh no, it clicked away from me and I can't go back. That's crappy. Okay. We'll get back to it in a minute, but there is a brain. There is a heart, but it's in the form of aortic arches, which we'll talk about when we get to the anatomy a little bit more. So we do have some more specialized anatomy here with these critters compared to like the mollusks. So their body is cylindrical, so it is round and long. They have bilateral symmetry. They have a true coelom with that separated septum here, the mesentery. You see here, this is the septum. Across it here. Let's see what else. They are segmented, so they have that metamerism, so each segment's kind of the same, which helps with their movement. Okay, they do have a complete digestive system, which means that they have a mouth all the way through an anus. Food travels from the mouth to the pharynx, to the esophagus, through the crop, the gizzard, the intestine, and the anus. This is extremely important, as this is a evolutionary like breakthrough that they have a much more efficient digestive system. So the pharynx helps grind the food into larger particles. Some of these annelids are going to be carnivorous. A lot of them, though, are scavengers or detritivores, where they feed on dead stuff and help break it down back into organic compounds to be put back into the ecosystem. The pharynx kind of acts like a pump, just like we did with the flatworms. It kind of sucks food, it could be soil or detritus, into the mouth and then forces it back through the esophagus to the crop. Some of these annelids are going to be parasitic, where they use that muscular pharynx to latch on to their host, and typically are bloodsuckers. So we'll look at some blood-sucking worms today. And some aquatic annelids are actually filter feeders, and they have like these feathery fan-like appendages that help capture food particles and then pull them into their mouths. The aquatic ones do have gills. The terrestrial ones, however, get a lot of their oxygen, or they get all of their oxygen through their moist skin, and their that skin layer has a protective coating on it called a cuticle, and it helps keep their skin moist. So terrestrial worms get their oxygen through their skin. Aquatic ones will use their gills. As far as circulatory system goes, they have a closed circulatory system, which means that blood is going to be contained in blood vessels throughout the entire body. They have a dorsal and a ventral blood vessel. So they've got one on their back and one on their belly side, big blood vessels that run the entire length of their body. And then they have these arches, like these little mini hearts that run, that are basically on the outside of the pharynx, that run across it and help pump the blood and circulate it throughout the body as well. Okay, so in this picture, see if I can find a color you're going to be able to see. Okay, we've got this dorsal blood vessel running here. There is a ventral blood vessel running here all the way down the length of the body. And then there's these arches. There's like, I think 5. Yeah, there's these 5 arches. Those are the heart. That's the heart. And that's how blood gets passed between the dorsal and ventral blood vessels. They're called aortic arches. As far as excretion goes, solid waste is released through the anus. Other waste products is removed using those primitive kidneys, those nephridia, and then excreted out of the tiny little holes that are throughout the body segments. It's called a nephridiopore. So throughout those segments, or throughout each of those segments, there's a nephridia that helps get rid of the waste in that segment, and then the waste is excreted through the nephridiopore, and solid waste through the anus. Nervous system, they got a pretty well developed one. They marine annelids can have things like tentacles or photoreceptors. They might have 2 or more eyes. So that mostly for the marine ones, are the ones with the tentacles and the photoreceptors. They might even have statocysts, especially the marine ones, which helps them detect their movement up and downward in water. So it helps them with the gravity situation in water. A lot of other annelids, like the earthworm, have a much more simple nervous system, where they rely on cells that are actually in their skin to detect their environmental surroundings. They can feel the temperature, the moisture, the heat, all through just the cells on their outer layer of their skin. So that nervous system here, again, that very first layer, that very first segment of a worm is the prostomium. And in that prostomium, there's a ton of nerve endings you can see here. And then just after the prostomium is where you get the mouth. And then you'll have the buccal cavity, which just means the mouth cavity. And then food would pass into the pharynx. But you can also see there's a lot of lateral nerves running the length or the around the body. And then there are a large nerve cord that runs on the ventral side of the body as well. These guys are going to have 2 groups of muscles. They're going to have longitudinal muscles that run from mouth to anus, and then they will have shorter muscles that are circular, that are around the body, that help them with this inchworm kind of movement. They extend and then contract to help with that movement. And then this is giving you a visual on those tiny little hairs that some worms have along their bodies called setae, and that helps them with that motion as well. It gives them some way to like hold on, grip, or provide friction so they don't just slide around. Annelids, most of them anyways, reproduce sexually, so there's going to be sperm and egg involved, but there are a couple that can reproduce through budding. Eligiochaetes, those are going to be the earthworms. They are hermaphrodites. So that means that they contain, one individual earthworm has sperm and egg, and that during copulation, they're going to exchange sperm with one another so that they both become, both of their eggs become fertilized. And in order to do that, they line up in opposite directions. So the heads are facing away from each other, and they have this section on a worm that you've ever seen. It just looks like a collar or a thick band, closer to maybe the head, the anterior, the head end of the earthworm. It's like just a thick band. It's called a clitellum, and it secretes a mucus that helps hold the worms in place. So they do face in opposite directions. let's see if I can even do this. They face in opposite directions, and then at that clitellum, they produce that mucus so they stay together and they don't just, fall off of each other. The clitellum actually will act like a cocoon where fertilized eggs will develop if reproduction has been successful. So this is just showing you that they'll exchange sperm. And then they will, the marine versions, I swear I'm just tongue-tied lately, the aquatic worms produce something called trochophore larva, which is just pictured here. It's just a very tiny larva that's basically a mouth, a stomach, and an anus. And then it'll slowly go through different phases to develop into that adult worm, as you can see here. And in this case, the adult worm, it has very large setae on the sides, but you can see how these, it starts to become segmented here in the second picture, and then it's fully segmented by the third picture. So we're going to talk briefly about these three classes of worms. We have polychaetes. The word poly means many, and in this case, chaetes is referring to hairs. Oligo, I always think only, so it's just only a couple, so a few. And Hirudinae is going to be the leeches. So as far as polychaetes go, they have a lot of hairs all over them, and the hairs are kind of attached to these little nubs that are basically little feet, kind of. So that's what, let me see here, that's what these little guys here are. These are the feet, and there's one pair on each segment. And then there are the setae attached to them here, the little hairs. But they're kind of paddle-like, and it helps with movement and with crawling. And the setae are kind of in those bristly kind of things. Polychaetes are all aquatic and marine. So, and they typically hang out around coral reefs. Don't need to worry about that. Just giving you a visual of what a polychaete would look like. You can see the many setae out here and the pseudopodia, or parapodium, sorry. They do have tentacles, and they are predatory. They do have a jaw, primitively, so they can eat other small organisms. Fireworm, isn't that crazy? You can see them on the coral. All right, so oligochaetes, these are the earthworms. They only have a few setae. I was talking about that clitellum, that like thickened band area. That's this here. Okay, they do not have any parapodia. These guys are smooth all the way down, no little legs or anything like that. They are monoecious, which if you remember, I'm going to write hermaphrodite here. It's going to take me like 10 minutes to write it. And watch, I'll probably spell it wrong. Hermaphrodite. Okay, monoecious also means hermaphrodite, which means a single organism has both male and female reproductive organs. So these guys are hermaphrodites. They actually play a really important role with soil fertility. The more worms you have, the more fertile your soil can be. They decompose waste products throughout the ecosystem, and when they poop, it goes back into the soil. Out at the gardens that we have at the school, we have compost bins. And in those compost bins, we have a couple of different breeds of worms, and their job is to break down that recycled material, that, leftover apple core and things like that. And they produce poop. that goes into the little bit of soil that we keep in those bins. And when we open those bins to put it in the garden, the soil will be black. It'll be super dark, and the darker the soil, the more rich it is in nutrients typically. They're also really good because the worms are really good because they tunnel through the soil, and that allows air and water to get to different parts of the soil. So in and around plants, worms are a good thing. And also those tunnels help kind of keep soil loosened up so it doesn't become like concrete. And that way roots of plants are able to travel through the soil and grow and expand a little bit more as well. So our common earthworm here, good at enriching soil. We talked about it actually makes soil when it poops. And without them, agriculture would just not be in a good spot because they're just as important as a pollinator. So giving you the grand tour of an earthworm, we have that first ring, that first segment, the prostomium, followed by the mouth, the clitellum, which is like the one section that isn't like ringed on a worm. They do have some very, very, very tiny setae, and then we have the anus here at the posterior end. So let me get rid of my video here so we can see. So again, following food through the worm, we go through to the mouth, and then we hit the pharynx here. Woo. Okay, and then it passes through the esophagus to the crop, to the gizzard, and then into the intestine. We also have here, we have the arches here, these aortic arches. I see that those are not labeled. I'm going to label those real quick. Those are the aortic arches. That like all together, that is considered the heart. So we do have a closed circulatory system here. My handwriting with the mouse is quite impressive, I would say. Okay, all right. We have the dorsal and ventral blood vessels here and here. We've got reproductive organs. It's really, really hard to locate the reproductive organs during dissection of these guys because all of their major organs are kind of just shoved towards the front of the body. At the interior end, you can see how many are up here. Once you get past the clitellum and like back through this part of the body, there's not much there other than the intestines and some muscles and the nerve. But like all the other bits and pieces are all kind of just jammed up in here. So it's really hard to find the testes and ovaries. So don't get discouraged if you struggle with that part next week when we look at the dissection. The body wall, so I wanted to show you, you have muscles that run the length of the body that are long, so they're the longitudinal muscles, and then we have ones that run around the body like in the circular area, so that are the circular muscles. The last class is the hyrunids. These are the leeches. They have no setae whatsoever, so no little hairs. And at the anterior and posterior ends, at the mouth and anus ends, they have little suckers, and it helps them attach to their hosts. These guys are all freshwater. They eat other invertebrates, so other little critters. They usually just feed on body fluids, though, most of them feeding on blood. Well, all of them feeding on blood. They usually don't get more than 6 centimeters long, which is about 3 inches, a little less than 3 inches. But there are some tropical species, because we know weird stuff happens in the rainforest, that could be up to 30 centimeters, which is a little over a foot long. I'll pass on a bloodsucker that's that big. So when these guys bite you and attach to you, they secrete a substance that keeps your blood from forming a clot, and because we know blood clots make bleeding stop. And if you're a bloodsucker, you don't want somebody to stop bleeding, so they release a substance called hyrudin, which keeps the blood flowing. It won't let it stop. So that's why the leeches, when they feed, they'll just get really, really large. And leeches can actually like grow 10 times their weight. They could take in 10 times their body weight in blood during a single feeding. And then they're good for a little while. So these are some fairly large leeches. Some damage of what it could look like if you yank one off. A lot of times if you just take a match or a lighter and kind of put it near the leech, it doesn't like it and it'll let go. One of those tropical ones that makes my skin crawl, like I just got the goosebumps from it. Again, what happens if you just rip one off? And all right, so the reason I like this picture is because you can see the attachment points here. You can see the sucker here and here. Now, which end is which, I don't know, but they use both ends to hold on tight. These guys are used in medicine. There's been cases where people maybe get frostbite or cut off a finger and it's been reattached. Well, in order for body tissue not to die, they got to make sure it's got blood flow. It's got to get oxygen, right? So let's say my nose gets frostbitten. They would attach a leech to the tip of my nose so that as the leech is drawing blood towards the tip of my nose, and that's providing nutrients to the tissues that are frostbitten in hopes that the tissues will stay alive and not, die and have to be removed. They'll do that with, oh crap, what was my other example? Frostbite and, like if you cut a finger off and they got to make sure it's getting good blood flow, they'll attach, leech to the end of your finger to make sure it's drawing blood and getting to those tissues so they don't die. So pretty creepy, but yeah, we totally use these guys in medicine. So what I want you to do is go to the Google Doc that's on Google Classroom with your lessons. There's a link to it. And there's a link in Google Classroom, and watch some of these video clips about worms that I've got. I've got one on there about, I think it's called worm grunting. There's one on there on medical uses of leeches. There's just a couple of them. Some of them are pretty creepy, but they're pretty neat. So give them a look. And, sorry, we'll talk about this more soon.